Hello and welcome to the 10th episode of Hammer Time. Today I have a special treat for you. A couple of weeks ago I had a wonderful conversation with Tom Nelson, and I really wanted to share with you. I think because many of the topics we've discussed on this show and elsewhere, we really kind of found a good approach to tie together many of the more general issues that we've been talking about. And as kind of the great surprise of today, I finally managed to get Konstantin Kisin for an in-depth conversation about similar topics like those I talked with Tom about. So I think those two conversations go really nice together, and I definitely wanted to share them with you. So I hope you can forgive me if it's a little bit different than from our usual show, but I would forever regret if I could not have shared the insights and views and debates we had on those two shows. That being said, let me once again thank you for keeping the faith with the show. I think we have much more content coming up in the next couple of weeks. We have much more additional interesting guests, and all of this is possible because of you. You have been a fantastic audience so far. I very much enjoy your comments in the comment section. I try to react as quickly and as reliably as possible. It's all very civilized discourse. You're a wonderful audience, and I'm very much looking forward to interacting more with you. That being said, let's jump right into the conversation that I had with Tom, and it's right here, right now.
Reflect on this for a second. I mean, it's a very odd question. We live in the 21st century, and Germany was, until recently, one of the top 5 leading industrial economies. And now we are forced to have a serious conversation. If it's a cold winter, will the German people freeze to death? That's a medieval conversation. These are conversations you probably had 500 years ago. If it's a cold winter and we don't have enough firewood, people will die. And we are literally retreating to a medieval mindset. And this, again, I believe is what you and I, justifiably so, have sometimes accused the radical environmentalists, at least, as you guys want to take us back to a medieval form of living. For everybody else, not for yourself, of course, because the John Kerrys and Greta Thunbergs, they need their private jets to make sure that they can, go from conference to conference where they then talk about why Ralph and Tom cannot use a jet, private or otherwise. But the idea that humanity must retreat to its kind of pre-industrial stage is, at least within the more radical members of those movements, that also nicely dovetail with the so-called degrowth movement. I mean, this is where they want to go. And they say, no, we don't mean this. We just, her name is Eva Hermann. She wrote a very popular book in Germany where she said, if we really take the entire issue, climate, everything seriously, we have to go back to the 1970s. She says, if we all got the 1970s, that's the kind of living standards that we can keep. And it's not so bad. The 1970s were not so bad. No, the 1970s were not bad. If you looked at them from, let's say, the 1870s. But in 2024, do you really want to go back to the pre-internet age? Because a friend of mine also said, well, but in the 1970s, when you look at the movies in the 1970s, they're all nice. I said, okay, fine, then give me your smartphone. Right? Cut off internet connection. Go to the dentist. Go to medical treatment with the standards of 1970. Go to a hospital with the standards of 1970. So these are, absurd proposals that nobody should take seriously. But unfortunately, I think due to the cultural, academic, and media environment, too many of our politicians do take it seriously.
So aren't there some causes for optimism in the election results in Germany just from the last few days, that it seems like some sanity is returning?
That's what I'm hoping for. I mean, these were regional elections, so let's see what they tell us about the broader repercussions for next year's federal election in Germany. But one issue that we have, and these days there's a tendency on both on the left and the right to sometimes go too far down the rabbit hole of conspiracies. But I think one thing that is going on, and that is not a conspiracy, is that there was a shift in the way how democracy works. That it's no longer that the people are the sovereign, but that, let's say, certain institutions are the sovereign. So now it's about for example, in health areas, what does the World Health Organization say? What does the UN say? What does the EU say? What does the Environmental Protection Agency say? So you have kind of this alphabet soup of institutions and organizations that apparently governments very often think that they have to live up to their expectations, but not to the actual expectations of their people. And I think this is one of the bigger problems. So people try to vote out certain policies, but then the argument is, well, we see what you voted for, but we can't really do anything about it because this has been agreed on in, contract so-and-so with institution so-and-so. So there has been a diminishing, I would argue, of the actual impact a vote has, which is, I believe, why people are so frustrated. And this is Neil Oliver's argument that I agree with a lot of the things that he's saying is you have a kind of a uniparty system, meaning that it doesn't matter whom you vote into office, the policies never seem to change. I would slightly add that is especially true if you vote for right-wing parties, because usually when you vote for the left, they are very willing to push for their ideological primers, so therefore their ideological program. But as Mark Stein used to say, but very often if the right gets elected, they're in office. When the left gets elected, they're in power. And I think that difference shows.
You did point out that the youth in Germany, there's supposed to be this assumption that they are all green, but they really rejected the whole green idea, didn't they, in at least these regional elections?
At least if you look at the polls, right? Both at the polls and in this case, when you mentioned the actual election results, the idea that the Green Party is the party of youth, that green is kind of the color of youth, at least in Germany, we'll see how it is going to be in other countries if we take a closer look. I think those days are over. So the Green Party is no longer the party of the young people. They are now, for better or worse, right? Some people would say it was about time. They are now a regular establishment party. Right? They are no longer a revolutionary party. They kind of still sometimes like to have the frisson of being the counterculture. But green is, as at least in media, in culture, in academia, in pop culture, the green positions are mainstream. Like there is nothing revolutionary. Like if you go somewhere and say, I vote, if you go to a fancy cocktail bar or a swanky restaurant and you say, I vote for the Greens, people say, so do I. 90% will agree with you. Like if you go and say, I vote for the quote unquote far right, now this is where you get a reaction. Right? So the days where the left-wing hippie with the kind of, the counterculture or something, these days are over. They're like they're the most adapted, boring, lukewarm kind of politicians and as a movement that is out there at the moment. There's nothing exciting about them anymore. And I believe, of course, that particularly young people see this. And as another quick point, they suffer directly from their policies. I mean, this is when, for example, we talk about open borders as a big issue, of course, especially in German politics. Open borders are frustrating for many layers of society, but it's ever harder for schools to deal with this problem. Right? The school quality goes down because nobody speaks the native language anymore. It has an impact on jobs, right? It has an impact on housing prices. It has an impact on pretty much all the things that are necessary for your daily life. So young people look into the future and say, well, my parents grew up in an environment where tomorrow, or there was a tendency that tomorrow was always better than today. And the day after tomorrow was even better than the day, was even better than tomorrow. Now they look at this and say, if we look where things are going, it seems as if the situation is getting worse day by day by day, right? Founding a family, almost impossible. Owning property, almost impossible. Having a single payer income to feed a family, basically impossible by now. So this is not a very encouraging outlook for young people. And then, of course, you have the safety concerns, whether it's for women or whether it's for men, right? We have growing instances of violent gangs, very often with migrant backgrounds. You have public security issues. And of course, all these negative things also then bleed through to the larger population, right? If crime rates go up among the migrant population and nothing is done about it, then it's only a matter of time until the native population, if I want to use that expression, will also get more criminal, which, to be frank, makes a lot of sense. Because imagine you live in a society and you see people doing things that are wrong and criminal, and they don't get punished. At some point, you will also engage in criminal activity, not because you want to, but you say, if everybody does it, why should I be the only one who doesn't do it? It reminds me of, imagine you work at an office and you have one colleague who steals pens from the office every day. Like if one guy does it and nobody else, say, okay, fine, you wouldn't do it either. And you say, okay, the company probably doesn't know. But then another guy does it, and then another guy does it. And then, 90% of the people steal their pens and their toilet paper and their printing paper, whatever it is, from the office. And the office manager never does anything. Right? At some point, you, Tom, will also say, why should I be the schmuck who buys his own pens, who buys his own paper, who buys everything on his own time while everybody takes it from the office? So you start doing lifting to go unpunished, you'll get more of it. I'm so befuddled by both sometimes on the right, but also on the left, how these very, unsurprising features of human nature constantly befuddle them. If you allow wrong behavior to take place and you say it's not so bad, you'll get more of it. If you would tell your children, kids, if chewing gum, candy, you don't have to pay for this. Just take it in the store. It doesn't really matter. Of course they will do it. I mean, it's so absurd. If you don't punish, or if you don't have any kind of deterrence for bad behavior, you're going to get more of it. It's very odd that as I said, that this continues to surprise people, that they have these weird arguments, right? They say, well, if you punish shoplifting, or if you don't punish shoplifting, the costs will be the same. But if you don't punish it, you'll get more of it. And then you end up in a situation where you have then, I think, what they call food deserts, because, I don't know, Walgreens or Target, or you name the stores, they will no longer open shops in certain areas because they say it makes no sense for them. We open a store there, people loot our stores or shoplift from our stores, and the government says, don't be so sensitive. Is it really such a big problem? So it's very absurd to know is how things that make complete sense seem to surprise the elite class that pushes for these negative policies. Quick other example, I don't want to digress too much, but I think it all fits into this. Policing. This absurd idea that if you have fewer police or less police, well, English is not my first language. It's either fewer or less. You'll get less crime. I mean, that was always an absurd. There was always an absurd argument. But if you have high crime areas and you say, if we have fewer policemen there, then crime will start to go down. Like, this was always absurd. But so many people lap this up with, like, the greatest wisdom. I mean, you have currently in the United States, you have a presidential candidate on the side of the Democrats who literally made that argument. Police is not the solution to crime. And once again, right, this is what they tried in Europe. But they say, no police. We need social workers and street workers. And no, you don't. I mean, in some areas, yes. But the point is, you also need to punish crime. And you also need to create a condition under which people don't want to do this. I mean, Patrick Moynihan, right? I think he was a Democratic senator from New York was it in the 80s or even earlier? I'm not entirely sure. Like, your viewers can correct me. But he had this great phrase of what he called defining deviancy down. And I think this is precisely what we currently see. If you say that small acts of criminality are not a problem, you're going to get more of it, and you will also get crimes that are worse. So this is for me always a surprising thing, that you cannot turn a blind eye to these things, because people have an innate sense of fairness. They have an innate desire, I would only say, to see those who break the rules being punished. And if this is not happening, they will adapt accordingly. I give you one story, but I think it's a good one. I give you one last example. If I, as an individual, could make the choice to say, officially I live off welfare, and I do some marijuana, some drug dealing on the side, so I get some additional money. But of course, that's an illegal activity, so I'm not going to report it to the state. So suppose I have two incomes. I have one income that I get from the state, and I have one income that I get from my illegal activity. And then say another guy decides to start, let's say, learning a trade, becoming a baker. So that guy gets up every morning at 4 a.m. to stand in front of the oven in the bakery, work very hard, like does all the honest, good work. He's going to be taxed 50% of his income, right? Has horrible working hours, has barely any vacation. And then he looks at his friend who is not working at all, is receiving whatever comes out of the other guy's paycheck, and kind of, pushes up his average income by doing some drug dealings by the side. So at one point, the guy working in the bakery is going to say, you know what, screw that. I'm also going to get unemployment benefits and do some illegal or untaxable activities in the black market by the side. And this is what they don't understand, particularly on the left. It's not about that you say, we don't want to punish the individual too much. It's about that if you create conditions where individuals can game the system and you do not punish or prevent that gaming of the system, more people will start to try to game the system. And at some point, there will be a breaking point. And then the entire system breaks down. None of this, as I said, none of this is a conspiracy. None of that is a surprise. These are, if you want, the laws of human nature. If I can get the same income with working 20 hours a week as somebody gets with working 80 hours a week, at some point, the 80-hour guy will also switch to whatever the 20-hour guy is doing. It makes complete sense. There should be no surprise there.
Yeah, very, very well said. What do you think is going to happen? Look, getting out your crystal ball, looking ahead 20 or 30 years. Is there anything to this whole fourth turning thing where there are cycles in the way human activities go, and there's going to be sanity returning coming out of the far end of this? Or what do you think?
Well, I think I think the book is fantastic. I mean, I think that they have now milked the idea of the turning. I think for now it's 3 books, or is it 4 books? It's like the turning is coming, the turning is here, the turning is upon us. So, but fair enough. I mean, it's well written. There's a lot of knowledge in it, so I like it. I think the big question we always have to ask is, yes, I mean, are there, let's say, cyclical, or could you identify in hindsight somewhat of, like, let's say, cyclical developments in human history, at least in some areas? I think the answer is yes. But the big question is, there is no guarantee. The question is, let me put it this way: if you're in a downward cycle, or in the downward part of the cycle, can you be absolutely sure that there will be at some point an upward drift again as well? And the question is always, when we look at a civilizational level, is because people always like the comparison with the Roman Empire or with Rome in general. Well, but the Romans made it the better part of 1,000 years. So you can look at that. That's pretty good. The West hasn't even reached half that time. So the idea to say, yes, after every downturn, there is an upturn, I'm not so sure about this, because the rest of the world has gotten smarter. And what I mean by this is, if your civilization is going into a downward spiral for a time, and everybody around you is so far behind, you can afford a down period because the others are just too far behind. I'm not sure if this is true today. Now, the United States, we'll see. But for example, in the case of Europe, I do not see any signs in Europe that there will be a European Renaissance, that there will be a form of a new European, a new enlightenment, a reformation, whatever term, religious or otherwise, you want to use. I don't see it. And the competition is not asleep at the wheel. Right? The Chinese, yes, the Chinese have many problems. China is not run as smoothly and perfectly as it could be. But like in every other competition, if I compete with someone, I don't have to be objectively the best in the world. I just have to be better than the guy I'm competing against. So we can say the Chinese do many stupid things. Yes, but I would argue the Europeans do even more stupid things. So at the end of the day, on the balance sheet of doing smart things, doing stupid things, in the European case, very often I would claim that the stupid stuff is outpacing the smart stuff, and in China, the smart stuff is outpacing the stupid stuff, even though both exist. And I can give a quick example for this. Artificial intelligence, right? I mean, there's with few exceptions, but artificial intelligence is at the moment a field that is dominated by China and the United States. There is no reason why Europe should not also be a major player in this field, because I don't think that on average Europeans are more stupid than the rest of the world. But we have created systemic, structural incentives that just don't make it worthwhile for anybody who would have the needed qualifications or talent in Europe to engage in it. And that is, I think, very hard to overcome, because, as you know, it's true in the United States and elsewhere. Once these structures are in place, people get used to it. It's very hard to change them. So to switch like it is in Europe from a system that is at the moment strongly focusing on regulation, right, on bureaucracy, and say we're gonna, break this change and unleash which I'm sure is there, the creative and innovative potential, then it's very difficult, because all these agencies, good Lord, all these agencies and all these bureaucrats who are in charge of these institutions, I mean, those are their jobs. That's their meaning in life. They want to keep that around. Right? If you go, let's say, to the crazy guy, the crazy EU commissioner, Thierry Breton, right, who constantly thinks that he can I don't know, force Elon Musk to tell him how to run Twitter. Right? Who's always super proud that Europe is the first place that has AI regulation. At the Digital Services Act will ensure that nobody will say anything hateful or mean on social media. If you would tell, you cannot tell such a person that they are the biggest obstacle, for example, to having a social media platform. I mean, this is the irony. The Europeans talk about moderating content on social media platforms. We should be talking about what you have to do to create social media platforms. The Chinese have their own platforms, right? The United States, of course, have the most famous one with X and Instagram. But What do Europe have? I think there was one, it's called Mastodon, or sort of like this one platform that nobody ever uses, or 200 people. It's like, I think fewer people use Mastodon than using Donald Trump's True Social. And that's pretty much a platform where only he is on. And this is, I think, the real problem, that the bureaucratic agencies, they become self-perpetuating. And we do not have the kind of political class for now. Again, this is the big unknown that really goes in and says, we're going to break this up. But this is no longer just about reform. This is, I would argue, not necessarily violent, but this is closer almost to revolution. So because it's not just about, let's change how these institutions operate. The question is, do we need these institutions in the first place? And I think that's of course a much bigger question. So it's not that we say, oh, regulation is good, we just tweak the wrong places. The question is, should we stop tweaking certain places at all? And another point that is equally important, of course, that companies and industries have colluded in this, because they have, which I understand, at least from a short-term mindset, because they have understood, if you understand the regulators, you no longer have to serve the customers at the market, which is much more difficult to predict. You have just to serve whatever the regulators want. And going back to our favorite topic, the energy market. I mean, one of the reasons why the German companies went all in, and others as well, on EVs is not so much, is at least my argument, that they believe that EV truly is the technology of the future. It might be hybrids, but I don't think it's EVs for now, given the state of the technology. But they understood that regulators want to ban the internal combustion engine. They want to give taxpayer money to people who buy EVs. So the governments, the institutions were creating incentives that would more or less force or strongly suggest to the consumers to buy EVs. So the car company said, this is great, right? We no longer have to compete with the market. We no longer have to compete with others. We just have to make sure that the regulation is created in a way that people must buy whatever kind of car we're building. So look at this from this perspective. If somebody tells you, if you say, I develop, you make cereals, and then they say, oh my God, some people like fruity cereals, some people like, but some like them with nuts, some people like them with raisins, so like you need a wide variety of products, and you never really know who is going to buy what, and then maybe you make a wrong decision. So it would be great for you if the government steps in and says there are only two kinds of cereal, and those are the two kinds that the people have to buy. And then you, Tom, can say, great, so my decision making is done for me. There are two kinds of cereals. I make those two kinds of cereals, and the government is even paying people to buy my cereal. You no longer care about what the customers want, because you cannot serve their desires anyways. And this is, of course, also what happened in Europe. So this is not just, I have almost the same defense of bureaucrats and politicians. This was not just their fault, right? Industry in Europe went along with it. Like, nobody rose their hand and said, listen, this could work very well, which it did for 10, 15 years. But at some point, when the Chinese, when the Americans, when others who still have a somewhat competitive approach to industry, when they start to overtake us in production costs, in technology, in quality, we'll have a problem. And the fact is, if you look at quality and price of the BYD, the Chinese electric cars, they are fantastic cars. Like, the Germans cannot compete with it. I looked up the recent numbers. BYD sells more electric cars than all the electric cars produced together by all German car manufacturers. That tells you what it is. And this is the absurdity, right? So in a sense, the German government, the European government has created a situation where they believe they subsidize the European consumer and European industry, but it actually turned out that they were subsidizing the Chinese industry and the Chinese Communist Party. And as I said before, on the long run, or even back in the day, this was foreseeable, because we know what the Chinese do. They did it in the solar industry. They did it in the wind industry. They do it now in the EV industry. They will do it in the semiconductor industry. They will do it in the nuclear industry. As I said before, the Chinese do many things wrong, right? The Chinese are, there's a real estate bubble. There is sometimes houses that are collapsing. There are ghost towns. So there's a lot of Chinese hype, let's put it this way, that is overshooting, let's put it this way. But at the same time, they also know how to do things right. And usually if the Chinese Communist Party puts its entire weight behind achieving something in industrial policy, they might not achieve it, let's say 100% of the time, but they achieve it 89% of the time. And very often that's enough. I mean, I cannot, if you're also for your viewers and listeners, what China accomplished in the electric vehicle sector is incredibly impressive. Right? And I'm not a stooge for the Chinese Communist Party. I'm European. I want Europe to flourish. But you have to admit if somebody else does something better than you do, because that's the only way how you can improve yourself. And there is this kind of, also in the United States, there is this complacency. But very often there is this, less in the United States, but still this idea that, the Chinese, they can just copy, they can just imitate, they can't really do anything on their own. And that is partially true, but only partially. And the thing is, even with copying stuff, they then end up, picking the best things from all the American and European companies. They don't have, of course, the research and development costs, and then they put together their own electric car, for example, that has all the best elements of German companies, of Japanese companies, of American companies, and you end up with a cheaper, better car. The Chinese don't play by the rules. That's, I think, the big difference, for example, to what happened when Japan was admitted into the World Trade Organization and was integrated into the global economy. The Japanese played by the rules, or let's say the Japanese, not entirely, they had their subsidy schemes, so they also had their ways, let's put it this way, but not to the extent as China does. China is not playing by the rules. And again, I don't want to be China-phobic or xenophobic, whatever the term that is, but this is something we have to reckon with. That the Chinese believe, and I think that belief is probably justified, that China is, or that for most of human history, the center of human development, the center of, demographically, population-wise and everything was in Asia. That human history, if you see it as a whole, has been for very long, for its majority, been centered in Asia. And that then let's say the Western or European period, whatever you want to call it, was an aberration from the norm. And that now the world is gradually returning to what the norm is, which means that you have the Middle Kingdom, whatever then you want to call it, I'm exaggerating slightly for dramatic effect, and that everybody else has to metaphorically kind of bow to the elevated position of the Chinese. I mean, I'm a little bit of an imperialist myself, so I have a lot of sympathy for that position. But this is what we have, what we have to deal with, and we are way too sanguine, in my opinion, when it comes to these relations.
How big of a deal do you think it is zooming out again, this whole idea that people are waking up after the lies of COVID? I've had so many people say to me in real life and online, I was a normie. I kind of believed what the media said until COVID. And at some point I figured it out. Now I'm questioning everything. I'm questioning the Federal Reserve and the big pharma and all kinds of things. How big of a deal from your perspective is that?
Yeah, I think I'm glad you asked. So it's a very important, a very crucial question. Now, let me begin by saying it can be now said without a doubt, and we can go into the reasons how you and I look at what the reasons for this were, but governments lied. I mean, at least we have now lots of the kind of internal protocols, how COVID policy was organized in Germany. Now we know that they tweaked scientific advice, scientific results in a way to justify their policies. So I think this can now be said without any doubt. Like, things were said about COVID, about vaccinations, that now in hindsight turned out not to be true. Some of it was business interest, some of it was malice, some of it was incompetence, and I'm certain where I think there is some truth there, that I think some of it was the idea that, to what extent can we expand state control without the people revolting? I do think there was a little bit this experimental attitude as well. So I completely agree with you that it was, and on another element also, it was shocking to see that if the government wants to, if the state wants to, how easily they can switch into a very repressive system. And when you think about when you had funerals where people were not allowed to mingle, where individuals were not allowed to visit their dying parents or grandparents in hospitals, when what we did to school children. Looking back, things that happened that were supposedly based on the science, in hindsight, appear absolutely maddening. So, and a lot of this, I think, there were some bad actors as well. I think again, in hindsight, somebody like Mr. Fauci was not the kind of person that he was made out to be. You know, and even the way he presented himself with Mr. Science. If you don't believe me, you don't trust the science. I mean, who are these people? It's the hubris. If I'm, which I'm not, if I'm Albert Einstein and I'm arrogant, well, people will say, well, he's arrogant, but he's Albert Einstein. So, you know, what can you do? He really is that good. But we have this problem that you have people who are not even that good, but they have the kind of arrogance and hubris as if they are that good. And I think this really justifiably so drives people mad. The problem I see now, and I can give you a quick example in a second. The problem I see now is that this entirely justified the distrust towards the state, towards institutions, and towards the way in which policy was done. And and the rollout of the vaccines, I'm fully in agreement with all the critics. But I think this has now morphed to, and maybe in parts also justifiably so, into a general distrust of every narrative that was agreed upon. So just recently, I saw that Tucker Carlson, who I was a long-time admirer, did an interview with a historian, and basically people can look it up, and I'm happy to have this conversation as well. So everybody, feel free to reach out to me if you want to talk about this in greater detail. But what basically the argument is being made that Winston Churchill was the bad guy, the Americans kind of, but actually Hitler was not the bad guy. It was just a very unfortunate thing. And the reason why this is more on the right than on the left, why this is all of a sudden becoming more popular, is because people are so, again, justifiably so, or a significant amount of the people that are very much online, let's put it this way, they're very much online. And as I said, I understand it. They have been so sobered up by the misbehavior, by the lies, by the gaslighting of governments during COVID that they say, you know what, I think everything else you told us is also wrong. So when they hear, we defeated the Nazis, they say, but did you? Right? They say, oh no, the Nazis were the bad guys. They say, were they? And which I understand the impulse, but I think this is also problematic. You see it and as I said, I know many people disagree, and that is fine. I mean, I think we still believe in an exchange of ideas, but I think this is something that you also see in the evolution of somebody like Candace Owens, like, and I believe she is when she said that everything is the Jews' fault, that Stalin was a Jew, and that Atatürk was a Jew, and that this was, so it's very odd. And yes, I know I already see the comments now that saying, oh, Ralph is a Zionist stooge and all this, but this is exactly the point, right? So you have this kind of that every narrative is wrong, and that is a consequence of COVID. Now, let me say just one more thing. But that's precisely why what happened during COVID was so bad. And I speak about the German government, I speak about the Austrian government, I speak about the American government. Did they really believe, or was their conviction, that you can lie to the people in one area of life, and then people will say, all right, you lied, but in every other area, you'll speak the truth? Of course, people will say, if you lied to us regarding a pandemic, how do I know that you don't lie to us in other areas as well? And I fully understand that sentiment. My fear is that this goes too far, right? The distrust is now or potentially at such a level that at some point, no government, doesn't matter if it's right wing, left wing, or center, they can no longer do any policy, because almost intuitively, some parts of the population will say, whatever comes from you, I reject. And this is a danger, but they should have seen this. And this is why, as use another example, this is why I think what the Swedes did was so remarkable during COVID. It was not that they, at the end, turned out to be right. I think what was so remarkable about what they did is that they did say to their people, we don't know if what we're doing is right or wrong. We think we're doing the right thing. We hope it works. Please join us on this way, on this path. And if it doesn't work, we have to deal with it. So the people in Sweden knew that their government admitted that they don't know, that they try to do their best, and that they are willing to admit if they make a mistake. And that's, I think, the big difference to what happened in other parts of the world, where government said, we know it all, everything we do is not to be questioned. They leaned on social media companies to mark everything that was critical of their policies as misinformation, disinformation. And it reminds me of what Jacinda Ardern, the then Prime Minister of New Zealand, said, her famous quote that everything that doesn't come from us is not true. And this is why I believe that the Swedish way, and this is, by the way, also nowadays, what I think that Sweden does, despite the problems they have with immigration and other things, that they are more capable of reforming, because there was always this admission from the government, even when it was the worst left-leaning government, that, you know what, there is a possibility that we are wrong. And what was so maddening during COVID was this, as I said, this hubris and arrogance to say, no, this everything we do is true. Everything we say. So if you say masks don't work under certain, it's not. We know now that it wasn't true. We know that young people are affected differently. And we also know now that there is no medical treatment, vaccine or otherwise, that has a 100% success rate. I mean, the claim that human beings are very different. And what I mean by this is that there are people who are allergic against penicillin. There are people who are allergic against sunlight. There are people who are allergic against lactose, gluten, you name it. People that are allergic against all kinds of our daily experiences. And then to say, we have here a chemical compound that nobody on the entire planet will ever have an adverse reaction to, was always an absurd claim to make. Yet they made it. And I think this is, of course, why people unjustifiably are upset and why they lost trust in government in one area. And this loss of trust has now spilled over in other areas. Now, the delegitimization of governments as a consequence of COVID is a problem, I think, that will be with us for a very, very long time.
So elsewhere, you've said some very interesting things about moral licensing. Do you want to talk about that issue a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, this goes back to something that we already talked a minute ago. I think this is another thing that justifiably so, right, that bothers many people is this idea that when I preach a certain lifestyle, I'm not myself bound by the premises of that lifestyle. So for me, it's always the John Kerry private jet kind of thing. When he was going on a private jet to Iceland to get a reward for some climate-related thing, and the journalist asked him, don't you think it's a little weird when you use a private jet? And he said, well, people who do the things that I do, they have no alternative to traveling. They have to travel in that way. They have to use that kind of travel. Or the famous Greta Thunberg thing, where she was taking a sailboat from Europe to New York, and then they had to fly the entire 7 or 3 or whatever it was, people crew back and forth between New York and Europe, which of course had significantly higher CO2 emissions if she would have just taken an economy class flight to New York. And I think you can see this in all kinds of areas in politics. I mean, this is no politician or many politicians are not really willing to abide by the kind of lifestyle that they ask others to accept. You see that the migration question, people are told to accept the fact that schools are breaking under the burden of being, after a huge influx of children that don't speak the language, that don't know the culture. And again, it's not the children's fault, to be very clear. Children are probably, this is where the Bible is correct, but children are almost always innocent. So this is not their fault. But the politicians who create those conditions are at fault. But their children, of course, will go to swanky private schools. I mean, look, my favorite example was during the Democratic National Convention. I was listening to Michelle Obama's speech, and she said, I think I'm paraphrasing, but that her parents were always suspicious of people who had more than they needed. I said, do you own a mirror? Like, I mean, the Obamas, and whatever you think about him as a president, that's all fine by me, but the Obamas talking about somebody having more than they need? I'm sorry. Oh, another thing she said was that we don't have the luxury of affirmative action by generational wealth. Really? So are you telling me that the daughters of Barack and Michelle Obama, that they get not a single dime from their parents? Like that they will have to work for everything on their own? And this is what I mean by moral licensing. So, or Jamie Pritzker of Illinois, right? You have a billionaire standing on stage talking about how horrible the billionaires are. But, and this is not the moral licensing point, but he's a Democrat. He's a left-winger. So therefore, he's a good billionaire. It's the other guys about, or I think from the Young Turks, so is it Hassan Piker? Goes out like one of, I'm sure that some maybe of the younger viewers know him. He does some Twitch stuff, and so I'm not really into this. So, but he's also like he's like this self-styled communist. And I think his parents were like IT millionaires in Florida. So this is this kind of moral licensing, right? That you go out and say, oh, I'm a communist. In fact, you live like a life as only the most wealthy individual on this planet could afford. You see it, by the way, also in elections. If you look, for example, at Germany, the Green Party, the party of multiculturalism, the party of the energy transition, the party of degrowth, what do they get most of their votes? They get it in the most affluent and wealthy areas of wherever they stand for election. It's not the working class. It's not the downtrodden that vote for the Greens. No, it's the rich kids. Or now increasingly, it's the elderly rich, the boomers. The Green Party in Europe is like the perfect example of what the boomer party would look like. Right? They sit in their paid off loft apartment in Berlin, have a glass of Prosecco or something, and then rail against the evils of capitalism. And this is again this kind of moral licensing. Bernie Sanders, the same thing. Bernie Sanders is a millionaire, and I think Bernie Sanders is honest enough. I think as soon as he became a millionaire, he started to rail against billionaires. So I'm sure that once Bernie Sanders becomes a billionaire, he will rail against trillionaires, so that he himself is always exempt from this. But this is another of the things that people are justifiably so mad about. The biggest issue, at least for me, what I see is that it's not so much about what is the kind of conversations and our theories, whether true or conspiratorial, are permeated and multiplied on the internet. That's a symptom, and I think it's a symptom for an unprecedented kind of anger, at least in modern history, in a kind of anger in Western societies. I think people are incredibly angry, and this is just a way to express that anger. And this is once again, I think, the problem that is not seen by so many is that this is the issue that you need to get a grip on, is that people are angry. People feel that they are, and they felt a long time that they are ignored, that they are being lied to. Right? So they want to demonstrate, to show their anger. And I think this is much more important than sometimes, or in all cases, than what the actual issue is. And as I said, I sympathize with that. I very much sympathize because I have to be honest, I'm angry too. Right? I'm angry in the European case that you see a continent that still would have so much potential being deliberately ruined by those who are in charge. And I do understand then that sometimes those who were called cranks 20 years ago, if I look back and say, well, they might be cranks, but they were right. Or as my favorite Canadian author, Mark Stein, used to say, if you have a cultural environment in which certain topics are beyond debate for respectable parties, for respectable people, then the voters will turn to the unrespectable people and the unrespectable parties. And I think that is correct. Let's put it this way. Migration is a huge issue. But if only the quote unquote, and I don't like these terms, I just use it because everybody uses it. If the only parties who talk about this are the far right parties, well, and I think this is an important topic, which it is, then at some point I will turn to the far right parties. The same thing, by the way, I believe happened with Donald Trump since 2016. If the Republican Party does not talk about the things that are important for conservative-leaning voters, they will turn to the person that does talk about it. And in 2016, from China to migration, Donald Trump did talk about the things that was important for conservative-leaning, for right-leaning voters, so they voted for him. And it makes complete sense because people don't trust. They didn't trust back then, that they don't know a Paul Ryan or a Mitt Romney or you name it, because they know that whatever they say, they don't really believe it. And in the case of Trump, by the way, as do I, in many cases, he does believe it. And I think that's a very big difference. And this is also the point why so often, and I understand as well, why one is willing to overlook certain, let's call it, shortcomings of such an individual. Because look at it from this perspective. You have a serious illness, like something that needs you need a very important surgery in order to cure yourself from whatever it is that you're ailing from. And then you have like a wider range of doctors. And it turns out that at least from your perspective, whether it's objective or true is a separate issue. From your perspective, the only doctor that seems to be capable of curing whatever it is that ails you is also the doctor who cheats on his wife, says stupid things, is raucous, is impolite, is all these kind of things. But you will say to yourself, these are all horrible things, but I need the guy who can cure me. And I believe that in addition to his hardcore fan base, that the same is true with the right wing in Germany. But the people say, we know that there are neo-Nazis for example, and there are. It's not a majority, I think it's a small number, but we should not deny or ignore it. There is a small number of neo-Nazis in the AfD. There is a small number of radicals in the MAGA movement. But if you believe, and I think in many areas that is justified, that belief, I share that belief, is you say, despite all these negative things that we are not blind to, this seems to be the only option to target the issues that everybody else is ignoring. You're going to vote for them. I'm always surprised, right, when people say, he's a populist, he seduces the people. The AfD seduces the people. If it would be so easy to seduce the people, why aren't the other guys doing it? Because they don't want to talk about the issues that are important for the people. They don't. I mean, was it Jeb Bush who said that illegal immigration is an act of love or something like that? So this is, you voters say we don't want illegal immigration. In fact, many say we don't want mass immigration. Period. And then the guy of your party says the exact opposite. Of course, you're gonna, like you as I said before, you're gonna go to the kind of doctor you think can cure what ails you, not what he tells you. Like going back to our example from before, you go to the doctor and say, I have a cold and I have cancer, and the doctor says, I don't care about the cancer. Let's take care about your cold. And this is for me very often the let's quote unquote the Republican Party of old, right? They talk about free market and libertarianism and lower taxes and so. But I think for many voters, that's the cold part of the disease. Crime, migration, these kind of things, it's the quote unquote. I'm not saying that migrants are like cancer. To be very clear, I just used a medical analogy. Just to be very clear, it's not what I'm saying. But for them, this is the more pressing issue. So they feel that sometimes the Republicans, they doctor metaphorically around on the superficial areas, but you want somebody who actually tries to solve the things that you see as the root cause of the problem. And by the way, again, this is the difference to the left. Like the left does what it says. So if Joe Biden goes in and says he's going to be indirectly the LGBTQ transgender president, he goes in and the Pride Progress flag is waving in front of the White House. Right? So when they say they do something, they do it. And this is what frustrates, I think, many on the right and also in the center. They say, we vote for the right wing, we vote for Republicans, we vote for European conservatives, and we always get left-wing policies. Ursula von der Leyen is supposedly a conservative politician, but she's the proponent of the green, it's in the name of the Green New Deal. Whatever you think of the Green New Deal, it's not a conservative position. So if the conservatives act like the Greens, well, you're going to look to the far right because the far right is acting like the conservatives. And I think this, again, whatever the media says, these are not mysteries. It's not that complicated. But unfortunately, we have a very odd class of both politicians and journalists who are no longer interested in reporting about the people, the country, the economy. They're interested in, let's say, educating the people. So again, the New York Times does not want to inform its readers. It wants to tell the readers, here's what you have to believe, and if you don't, you're dumb. And, well, good luck with that.
As you could see in this conversation, right, we touched on very many of the usual issues, from energy to what's going on politically and where generally society seems to move. And precisely the same issues I also talked about with Konstantin Kisin. And I think he had some very interesting points to make as well. As always, this is the first half of the conversation with Constantine. The second half is going to be available on Brussels Signal. And I always encourage you, please check out the YouTube channel. The link is in the video description. Check out the webpage. They do fantastic reporting. They do a fantastic news section. I think you would regret not subscribing to them and keeping them as one of your main sources of information, particularly regarding all things Europe. But for now, let's take a look at the first half of the conversation I had with Constantine.
Hello and welcome to the 10th episode of Hammer Time. And it is my great pleasure, after many announcements, and I can prove that was not a lie, that today I can welcome Konstantin Kisin. And I'm twice as happy because many people in the comments said, you should have Konstantin on. And I could say, patience, it will happen. And finally, it has actually happened. In this conversation, I want to start with something more uplifting potentially and something positive at these negative times, and something that, of course, relates very much to your original profession as a comedian. I've been working on a paper recently trying to figure out what kind of regimes, what kind of governments have been best in delivering for their people. And one correlation, maybe not a causation, I found, is the attitude of the state towards mockery, towards humor, towards giving people room to make fun of those who are in power. And ironically, very often, very brutal rulers sometimes. But you had Emperor Augustus, you had the Emperor Vespasian, you had Frederick the Great in Prussia. So not our ideal case of liberal Democrats, but they had a very relaxed attitude towards mockery, towards humor. And I'm wondering if there is maybe a correlation towards effective governance and a sense of humor, and that what we are seeing in our contemporary world is that actually governments are losing that sense of humor. I think, for example, in California, the Babylon Bee is now suing Governor Newsom over some meme issues. So that even though these democratic systems are democratic on paper, that a certain relaxed attitude towards mockery is disappearing. And I think that, of course, also then has repercussion towards free speech. Do you think I'm onto something, or is this a completely absurd assessment?
No, I don't think it's absurd. I wasn't aware of the people you mentioned, certainly the two Roman emperors and Frederick the Great being so open to mockery. I know that from a more modern perspective, I watched in Russia in the 90s the opening up of satire. We had lots of fun being made of politicians until Vladimir Putin came in. And the first thing he did was immediately shut that down. So I don't think it's a property of democracy versus not democracy exactly. But perhaps what you might be onto is that governments and rulers who feel insecure, who are not comfortable and secure in their position, they are the ones that are averse to being challenged because there's a lot to lose by having a loss of status and a loss of reputation. That could be it.
Wondering the same thing. I mean, you see this in some other areas as well. When, for example, there's a lot of discussions going on about Western civilization, at the decline of Western civilization. And you had fantastic guests together with Francis Foster on the Trigonometry podcast, from Neil Ferguson to David Starkey to others as well. And sometimes it feels that if we look at the high tide of Western civilization, I think it would be a fair assessment to say that it was somewhere around the 19th century. But I would make the claim that this was also the time where you had people like Oscar Wilde, where satire, where comedy was emerging. We had, Johann Nestroy in Austria. And that seems to show that you can be a kind of monarchical authoritarian system, but you can gradually move in the direction of becoming freer in your attitude towards expression, that government allows more criticism, it allows more free speech. And then you can reach a point, as it is now, where it seems to decline. So in absolute terms, we are freer now than we were 150 years ago. But I sometimes wonder, isn't the really interesting thing the trend? Is society the tendency towards more freedom, or is the tendency towards less freedom? And in which direction do you see us move at the moment?
Well, I think the one thing that's missing from your great analysis, Ralph, that we might want to add is the context of the technology of the time. I think the reason that there is so much movement in the wrong direction, as I think you and I probably agree, in the modern Western society, is that the technology that we use to communicate has become so much more powerful that what might have been said in a pub or in a bar with no repercussions 15, 20 years ago can now be potentially broadcast to millions of people. And so the politicians seem to be very concerned about, for very understandable reasons, things like foreign disinformation. I think it's actually a very important concern. A lot of people in the free speech camp, with whom I find myself in agreement on most things, underestimate, in my opinion, how much foreign interference there is in what we hear and what we read. And so people often take a kind of absolutist position that, Russia Today, great, let's have them broadcasting into Russian propaganda into our ears and into our eyes. Al Jazeera, again, this is an organization that's funded by the national government in order to mislead people. Again, let's just take the laissez-faire attitude to it. My point is that there's a lot of concerns about foreign influence and disinformation. There's also a lot of concern about people being able to broadcast inaccurate information, let's say, or the wrong opinion about certain things to a large number of people. This wasn't possible before. If you wanted to reach millions of people, you needed your own TV channel. You needed your own newspaper. Now we all have our own TV channel and newspaper in our pockets that we carry with us. So I think the technological shift has been very significant, which is probably, I suspect, actually the main reason that you are seeing these attempts to crack down on it. And that's kind of the big challenge for our society. How do we deal with the modern technology without losing our core values that we all think are important?
Do you have trust in the individual that they are capable of filtering out what is information, what is disinformation? Or I think what I'm trying to ask is, do you sometimes think that people, and I'm not excluding myself in this, I'm very much part of this, that we deliberately, you also had Jonathan Haidt on your show, for example, when we talk about confirmation biases, that we seek out information, of course, that strengthens our already existing biases. But at some point, we know that that's the case. Yeah, so it's not that we are entirely immune to our own biases. We know that we have them. And sometimes I feel that whether it's governments or other institutions, that they have such little trust in the people to being capable of filtering information on their own.
Well, I think most governments tend to distrust the ordinary person, and I think they are wrong to do so. Having said that, I don't trust people to always know that they're biased and always make the right decisions. I just think it's their right to be wrong and to suffer the consequences. So, during the pandemic, there was this huge debate about whether people are allowed to have this opinion or that opinion. People are allowed to take or not take the vaccine, all of this stuff. And my view was, obviously there's, the consequences for other people that sometimes can be in play. But if you choose to believe inaccurate information about a medical product or a food item or whatever, despite being told repeatedly by the government or by the authorities that it's harmful to you, and you choose to take it, well, that's on you, and you have the right to do that in the same way that, I believe that most people should have the right to take most drugs without being criminalized for it. I'm not saying taking drugs is good. I just don't think that the government should interfere with that. There's certain exceptions to that. So it's not that I trust the ordinary person or myself, frankly, to make all the right decisions. I just really, really don't trust the government to do it for me. And I would rather make the wrong decision and be wrong and suffer the consequences than live in a world in which the government takes away all my freedoms in order to protect me from the consequences of my own bad decisions. Those are the two things that are struggling against each other. And I think the individual is, in most situations, much better placed. There are exceptions to this, but we ought to trust people. That does not mean that people are inherently trustworthy.
If being asked, would you agree with John Stuart Mill's idea that in the battle of ideas, in the competition of ideas, that ultimately those ideas closest to the truth will win out? Or do you think that might be somewhat of a naive humanism?
I think it's an idealized version of reality, which again fails to factor in. I keep banging on about technology, it feels like, in this short conversation. But if you think about the reality of social media, which we'll observe with our own eyes if we're on it, I would not say that it is universally true that good ideas triumph and bad ideas fail. What I would say, as I'm watching it, is that sensationalist ideas triumph and true ideas can succeed if they're sensationalist, but will usually fail if they're not. So what draws people's attention is not the truth, but it's the appeal of something, the emotional appeal. So I don't think it's always the case. If you create some kind of artificial environment, like a debate, for example, in which there's an equal footing and an equal platform, etc., in that debate, if it's conducted properly, good ideas will likely triumph. But we don't live in that idealized kind of sterile, medical environment or scientific environment in which these ideas can be tested against each other in a double-blind experiment, like some kind of medication. So I don't think it's true, and I think you don't have to look very far in history to see that actually there are societies in which bad ideas can take over a very large number of people, or more likely over a very small number of people who accumulate all the power in their hands and then control the information that goes out to everyone else. There's, I grew up in the Soviet Union, which was formed in exactly this way, right? The creation of the Soviet Union was not the triumph of good ideas, and it was not maintained for 70 years by the good ideas. Now, you could argue after 70 years of bad ideas failing, reality plus good ideas won. That might be one way of looking at it. But I'm not sure that's always the case. Again, Nazi Germany was a place where very bad ideas triumphed for a very short period of time, and they were not won over by better ideas. They were won over by military force. So I think this is an idealized version of reality, but one that it is a perspective that has value, and we should remember that the best way to counter bad ideas will be good ideas, but there is also a power imbalance. There's the broadcasting technology and all sorts of other things that play into it.
And I guess it also depends a little bit on what one perceives as being the goal of a society in order to define whether something is a good or a bad idea. It was in the late 90s, an anthropologist wrote that his last name was Edgerton. He wrote an interesting book about cultural maladaptation. And he made the case that sometimes cultures create and come up with values that actually are less adaptive to their environments than other models. And I think one favorite example of mine are the Shakers, right? This religious group that can only pass on their belief by a conversion. So they live it in celibacy. So you cannot be born a Shaker. And their model to pursue people to join them is, saying, come to us. There is like no fun, no sex, but lots of praying. And that worked apparently in the 19th century. Now, I think I Googled it. I think there are like 2 Shakers left in the United States. I think one of them is a man, the other one is a woman. So they probably could get it going. But if they wouldn't be Shakers anymore. So I think that would be a case of maladaptation that you mentioned, so that there is no guarantee that the best ideas always win out. You spoke a lot and very eloquently, both on your social media accounts, but also on your podcast, about this debate that recently emerged about World War II and whether or not Churchill is the bad guy. And before I get into this, because I think it is an important conversation to have, or a conversation about that conversation to have, do you think that maybe COVID broke something? And what I mean by this is that the way in Austria it was the same, right? The way in which governments presented themselves to be so sure that they know all the details that then later on turned out that they didn't know. I don't want to use the word lie, but it created the impression, at least, that they were lying to the people. Did you have now this counter reaction that many people say, whichever narrative comes from the government, I don't believe. And if part of the narrative is that the Allies were the good guys and won World War II, and that it was a good thing that they won World War II, you say, oh no, that comes from, quote unquote, the elite. And there is an elite. I'm not entirely meaning this in a derogatory sense. And you say, then it must be wrong. Do you think that this is something we see, for example, in what's currently happening with Tucker Carlson and the guest he had on his show, that this is less about historical accuracy, but more about feeding into this idea, whatever comes from those in power must be wrong?
Yeah, I don't know whether Tucker Carlson specifically is a victim of this, but I think it's absolutely fair to say that the COVID broke a lot of brains. And you saw it first happening actually with Ukraine, where, and by the way, it's broken people's brains in both directions. So there are a lot of people who became absolutely wedded to the idea that whatever the government is telling them must be true. And it was interesting to observe, because I don't know if you remember this, but Donald Trump was in charge of the United States when the pandemic first hit, and he was desperate for a vaccine. Desperate. And he was pushing it very hard. And so all the Democrats at the time were saying, I'm not taking Trump's vaccine. Then the party switched, and suddenly you were evil if you didn't want the vaccine, and you had to take it because that's what all good people do. So I think it broke people's brains in both directions. But the thing you're speaking to is, of course, true. There are a lot of people who temperamentally, for their own reasons, and also financially, they're incentivized to feed the thing in people which says, I can't believe anything anyone's telling me. This is the thing that really came through with COVID. I think it was a more gradual process over time. The self-destruction of the mainstream media as a reliable tool for obtaining accurate information, which had happened over the previous decade or so, was also a factor. And then, for my generation, I think we're probably similar age, the invasion of Iraq was another example of when a lot of people lost faith in what they were told by government, because certainly, I don't know what the situation was like in Austria, but in the UK, it was pretty widely felt that the case for invading Iraq was completely baseless and flimsy, and yet the government lied us into it. So instead of saying what I suspect happened, which is, look, the Americans are going to invade Iraq. It is in Britain's interest to stand with America. Otherwise, we would lose lots of very valuable things. So we got to do this even though we don't agree with the case. The politicians couldn't make that argument, so they made up a bunch of bullshit and then basically lied to people. And, I was a young student at the time, but I remember thinking and probably saying to, nobody, because nobody was listening to me at the time. But, I thought it was a very bad idea for us to be misleading and lying, because it undermines the credibility of our governments with our citizens. It also, by the way, and this is important, undermines our ability to speak from a position of truth around the world. And so you get to a position like the one in 2022, where Vladimir Putin can absolutely lie about his invasion of Ukraine. And he has done so repeatedly. And there's plenty of times when he said he wouldn't do something and then has done it, and all sorts of things. And lots of people are tempted by that because they go, well, look, we've lied about this, we've lied about that. This isn't true. This wasn't true. Every time you tell a lie, you lower your credibility in the eyes of the people who heard that lie. And during COVID, we were told, that you hesitate to use the word. I think that we were told lies. And what I mean by that is not, the politicians sat there and said, we know the truth is A, and we're going to tell them B. But they were very, very willing to make claims for which they had no evidence, or which had very questionable evidence, about the efficacy of masks, about whether masks work or don't work, about whether lockdowns work or don't work, about whether they kill people or don't kill people, and all sorts of other things. And I think, yes, absolutely, a lot of people's faith in not just the elites, but the kind of all the institutions that we used to have as kind of the sources of what we believed. A lot of them have undermined themselves. And I always thought that was very dangerous. It's one of the reasons I opposed it so much.
Do you think when we look back at COVID, that one of the issues was that, and without getting too philosophical, but I think it would be an interesting question to ponder, that over the last decades, maybe since the 1960s, but maybe even a little bit earlier, maybe even at the turn of the century, from the 18th to the 19th to the 20th century, that with the decline of the importance in religion, right, with the idea there is us as individuals, there are communities we work with, there is the state, but then there is some higher power, a supernatural power, if you want, that ultimately is not responsible, but that is the true power. As this disappeared, that slowly but surely the state and the government has taken over that place. And when something like a pandemic hit, that the government, the state, and those who were part of that institution, that they felt that they cannot be wrong, that they are, I'm exaggerating for dramatic effect, but they are like God in a sense that the decisions they made, that the kind of the edicts that they published, right, that they broke no argument in a godlike fashion. But then, of course, when they turned out to be wrong, similarly to the person, I don't know, that prays every day to win the lottery or for something else, and at some point, if it doesn't happen, they say, you know what, God doesn't exist. And in the same way that if the government says, we know better, trust us, and give us even more power, and then they turn out to be wrong, that the reaction is, you know what, I no longer trust you in any area. So that there is actually, if you want, a social, cultural underpinning to this phenomenon as well.
That's interesting. I'd never thought about it like that. I have to say that doesn't ring true to me, but I'd have to think about it more to really have an opinion on it. What I would say in terms of the role of government and the loss of religion, there are other effects that I think are very significant. One of them is that we don't have, for technological and religious reasons or non-religious reasons, we have a very uncomfortable relationship with our own mortality. And if you view your life as something that is part of a bigger journey, let's say, your life on earth is part of a journey which ends when you die, but then it's continued in the afterlife and God knows what else. Then your own death in this world does not seem so important. And if you don't have that sense, if you have the sense that all you have is this life, then your behavior is going to be very different. And I think one of the things we saw during COVID was that a population of people who generally are very, very protected comparatively to history from death, disease, and other forces that are overwhelming, forces that are so powerful that they make a mockery of the idea that you're in control of your own life. If you look at the 20th century, for example, people living in Europe, they endured a global pandemic, 2 world wars, and all sorts of other events. There were a global depression, all sorts of other things that completely ruined the lives of many people who'd done nothing wrong. In fact, who'd done everything right all their lives. And suddenly war breaks out and they're dead, or another war breaks out and they're off in a camp somewhere, or they lose all their savings even though they're very comfortable, or they have to flee their country to survive, or whatever. So I think in previous decades, people were much more accustomed to the fact that life was unpredictable, death was just around the corner for everybody. Childhood mortality was so high that actually almost everybody would have seen somebody in their family die, probably their children, at some point. And so this kind of the expectation of eternal life, which we all kind of carry within ourselves until we're suddenly confronted. And then we're like, oh my God, I've got this thing, I'm mortal, is different. And then the other thing I think that has happened is partly because of that, but partly for lots of other reasons, is that because we have the expectation that everything should be fixable and our life should be under our control, we see every problem as caused by government very often. And even if it's not caused by government, to be solved by government. So I suspect that when the Black Death or the plague came to Europe, I don't know, I haven't read about it, I might be completely wrong about this, but I don't imagine people were sitting there going, oh yeah, the government should have had a better pandemic prevention strategy.
Why doesn't the king do more for me?
Right. They had some other pathologies. They looked for scapegoats and people to blame it on. And a lot of people would have said, we've displeased God or the gods or whatever. All of that would have happened. But what they might not have said is, the chief health officer of our country, if there was such a thing, failed, and that's why everyone's dead. Whereas now we kind of see every problem. I saw this in the UK and after the invasion of Ukraine, when energy prices went up very significantly. And suddenly everyone was saying, oh, we've got to protect people against the increase in energy prices. We've got to protect people against this. We've got to protect people against that. And it sounds kind of harsh and cruel when I say, well, maybe it's not the government's job. Maybe we all have to recognize that prices go up and down. And so we shouldn't spend money we don't have and be careful and set money aside, even if that's difficult, which I know for many people it is. And I say this as someone who has been very poor in many periods of my life and more rich in others. And so I kind of know what that's like. I'm not a rich person talking about it from that position. I just think if we can't expect the government to fix every problem, and we do.
Adding on to what you just said about things in previous times, do you believe it'd be justified to say that maybe there was also an assumption that most likely life is not fair? What I mean by this is that it's not so much that that good things are handed to you. It's kind of how you develop if bad things are handed to you. I think there was I think Theodore Roosevelt, there's one very great quote of him where he says that many people have to struggle with many problems and many issues, and he admires those who actually go through it in a stronger way. And because this brings me to your most recent, and if I remember correctly, your most commented on and most read Substack, where you wrote about your position on the Israel-Palestine conflict, what's going on in the Middle East. And kind of one thing that every time I hear of this conflict, and I'm curious to hear your take on this, is I'm reminded a little bit of, and we had this also just a little bit with the Tucker Carlson conversation, like World War II seems to be with us all the time. But of course, you could make, as some have, and I say this very carefully because I don't want to create a wrong impression here. But of course, you could make the impression that, of course, after 1945, a significant number of Germans were driven out of Poland, Bohemia, of these areas, and they did live there for centuries. You could make the claim that these were original German lands. But it didn't stop there, right? What then happened is they were driven out of these countries, and very quickly they reintegrated in other parts of Germany, in Austria, and wherever they moved. They were frustrated, kind of they tried to hold on to their traditions, but ultimately a pragmatic approach was chosen, right? This was the horrible what happened. It was unfair that just one part of Germany was punished more than the other. The same was, of course, with Eastern Germany compared to Western Germany, but there was a certain pragmatism. And when I talk to students about this, they say, yeah, but this was so long ago. But you could say, well, it's almost exactly the same time when the beginning of the Israel-Palestine conflict starts. And why was one side kind of taking a certain pragmatic approach and the other one is not? Because life is unfair. Like there are, unfortunately, and I don't mean it's a justification, the Kurds don't have a state, right? The Scots don't have an own state. And as I said, I don't want to, this is such a difficult conversation always, but do you think that sometimes the problem is the past is important, history is crucial, but if you never let go of it, then there is never any moving forward. Doesn't matter what the conflict might be.
Yeah, I think you make an absolutely fantastic point there, Ralph. I really do. And I think if you think about what the great myth of Western democratic liberal societies is today, it's the myth of equality. And what people have confused is the promise of equal treatment with a de facto equality in practice. And we are not born equal, and therefore equality is not possible. But the reason that just finishing off the point we were discussing before about wanting the government to step in, the feeling is, a lot of people seem to have this feeling, that if life is unfair, that's because the government's failed you. The government has failed you. And so the government's job is to step in and provide whatever is missing. Whereas I agree with you. I think it's inevitable that life is unfair. And your point about the German people is absolutely well taken. I think there are a lot of points about World War II that are often forgotten, because I agree with people that sometimes there's a very rosy, one-dimensional view of the history of that period. And it's absolutely true that Germans, what happened after World War II is that lots and lots of German people were left outside of Germany, and where they were, by the way, badly treated. And so one of Hitler's ambitions was to reunite those people. Having lost World War II, the arrangements that had been put in place after World War I were effectively reinforced and, in fact, added to with the splitting of Eastern Germany and Western Germany. And as you say, over the same time period as in Israel, the German people seem to have accepted this. I suspect partly it's because of the shame and guilt of Germany's conduct in World War II. That's probably one of the reasons. And of course, the Western powers, they simultaneously repeated the Treaty of Versailles, but also didn't. And what they did is they did make sure that Germany would not rise again, but also did so while making sure that German people were not resentful of what happened. And so they made sure that they were well provided for and rebuilt Germany and made it into a member of, one of the biggest and most powerful countries in Europe again, which is what it is today. But your point about the unfairness of life is so interesting when it comes to Israel, because it's not an issue I've really thought about until about a year ago. We had one or two guests in the past, and I was always kind of truthfully, a lot of Israelis don't like me saying this, because my ancestry, my grandfather was an atheist Jew in the Soviet Union, and so everyone assumes suddenly I'm I'm pro-Israel all of a sudden. People who like Israel and people who hate Israel both assume that. But actually, my attitude has always been one of truthfully, what I think most people in the West attitude is one of ignorance and not a huge amount of interest, truthfully. To me, Israel is a country far away to which I've never been, and it wasn't that important. But the arguments that have been made over the course of the last year, I've just tried to analyze them rationally. And one of the things that people always say about Israel who want to, say that Israel is doing something wrong or that October 7th was in some way understandable or whatever, and I talk about this in an article, as you know, is that Israel is illegitimate. The creation of the state of Israel is illegitimate. And I don't know if that's true. And I don't think actually it's that important whether that's true or not, because the creation of almost every country in which anyone who's watching or listening to this is the same. The United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, every country in South America and Central America. And by the way, on a long enough timescale, every country in the world was created through some kind of conquest, colonization, or whatever. So the question is, if your country was conquered or your people were displaced 75 years ago in some way, like the example you gave with the Germans who lived outside Germany, what today is Germany, do we want to encourage people to go back 75 years or 200 years or 500 years and to redraw the lines on the map? We can, but the consequences of that will be what we saw in Europe in the 1930s and 40s and what you're seeing in Gaza today. And the point I made in the article as well is ultimately, when you start killing people, when you start targeting innocent civilians, all of this goes out of the window. No government is going to tolerate, there is no better case for the illegitimacy of a country's creation than the United States. And the woke left have been making this argument for a very long time, as you know. Does that mean that Native Americans we should accept Native Americans breaking out of reservations, slaughtering civilians, taking hostages to lift their occupation and oppression? I mean, no one has a better case than them, as far as I can tell. But the United States government wouldn't tolerate that. And neither would the Austrian government, and neither would the Russian government, and neither would the British government, neither would anyone else. So I just think this attempt to undo history, like I'm not Palestinian. Maybe it's not my place to tell them what to do. But what I can say is, if you behave in the way that they did on October 7th, you should be extremely unsurprised when Israel behaves in the way that it has done in the last year since.
Well, maybe I would add one thing, and I feel that might apply to Russia as well as it applies to many regions in the Middle East, which is, and also, by the way, I think a little bit to Europe. There is this idea that countries, they had empires and that made them powerful. But I think this is putting the cart before the horse. Countries are powerful and then they get empires. Mm-hmm. Because if you take what everyone thinks about the conflict, I feel like I'm not well versed in it and I don't want to tell anybody what they have to feel and what they have to think. But I will make one argument that I would stick to that, which is, let's assume that tomorrow the Israelis say, you know what, it was true, we made a mistake, 9 or 7 million Jews and 2 million Israeli Arabs, they pack the stuff together, they leave, and let's say they come to Europe or wherever, it doesn't matter. And then finally you have from the river to the sea. I don't think that all of a sudden Hamas will say, aha, and now we will build a first-rate economy in this area with, startups. And yesterday I was the jihadi and today I'll be the undersecretary for sewage treatment or something. I don't think it works like this. And by the way, I feel, and this is why I'm curious about your take, I think this is the same that Russia is doing, right? So Russia has massive internal problems, and in kind of historical continuity to say, how do we solve the domestic internal problems? Let's expand. Because if we are bigger, this means we are stronger. But it's kind of, as I said, putting the cart before the horse.
Yeah. And also one of the things that I think is a great parallel between Russia and Hamas is that the desire to pursue these conflicts in the way that they're being pursued is also partly based on the importance of maintaining the popularity of the people who have power today. Vladimir Putin didn't really have a problem with his popularity until about 2014, 2013, when Russia had been so prosperous for so long that people started asking the question, well, look around, all these other countries around us who were part of the same bloc as us, they they are moving in a Western direction. They're moving in a democratic direction. And now that we are comfortable, why do we need this authoritarian dictator in charge for this many years? So what do? You create an external force, which you then react against, and you say, we must unite around me in order to deal with it. And Hamas is the same. I mean, the leaders of Hamas, those of them who are still alive, are not in Gaza. They live in 5-star hotels in Qatar, and they're all billionaires. And that's not because the people of Gaza have rewarded them for their great services, as you say, as the Undersecretary for Sewage Treatment. It's because they've taken the proceeds of the resistance, so to speak, all the international aid and all this other stuff and the Iranian money, and they've put it in their own pockets. And so there are a lot of incentives for these bad actors to maintain the conflict and to keep it going in order to benefit themselves. By the way, I know plenty of Israelis who feel that that's also true of Netanyahu.
To see the full version of this conversation, as I mentioned before, jump over to Brussels Signal. Until then, thank you very much for joining me. I'm very much looking forward to the next episode, which will be Hammer Time episode 11, coming up next week. Until then, stay safe, stay optimistic, and I'm going to see you soon.